New reporting from the Minneapolis Star Tribune finds that policing of last year's Line 3 pipeline protests was in part paid for by the very same company that stood to profit off the pipeline, to the tune of almost $10 million, almost twice as much as previously reported. That's right, a public safety account funded by Enbridge Energy reimbursed various law enforcement agencies a total of $8.6 million to police protests against the oil pipeline's construction.
According to the Star Tribune, Minnesota's Public Utilities Commission created the Enbridge-funded account so that taxpayers did not have to foot the law enforcement bill. However, civil liberties groups argue the controversial deal is a violation of protesters' due process rights. Joining us now to weigh in is human rights attorney Stephen Donziger. Welcome back to the show, Stephen.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us more about this, what sounds to me as a kind of curious funding arrangement for law enforcement, although maybe in my view not necessarily pernicious, but I'm sure you probably have a different view. Tell us more about it.
Well, look, there's nothing wrong with normal policing paid for by taxpayers. I think there is something wrong with what happened in this case, which is supposedly normal policing paid for by a private corporation that is funding a law enforcement effort to essentially suppress the rights of protesters who are protesting the construction of that company's own pipeline. And I think this is part of a broader, I would say, more foreboding trend we're seeing increasingly in the United States, which is increasing corporate control over what were normally seen as public functions of government, whether it's policing, whether it's our judiciary. I was prosecuted privately by a Chevron law firm in the name of the U.S. government for my work on behalf of indigenous peoples in Ecuador. And we also saw this not only at the Line 3 protest, but at the Standing Rock protest prior to that. And we're seeing it, ironically, in Canada. I've noticed there's a private corporate prosecution of an indigenous hereditary chief from British Columbia who protested a railway out there. So, these things start to take root. And I think the whole point of the fossil fuel industry is to make this the new normal, such that they can have increasing control over free speech in America. And I think that's the fundamental issue. Again, there's nothing wrong with normal policing. I think there is something terribly wrong with policing funded by a private corporation, particularly targeting mostly indigenous protesters who are on their own territory protesting the pipeline.
Yeah, it's really incredible, Stephen, that we have these really robust conversations about free speech violations in a lot of contexts, including online. And we live in a country where so many things are considered to be speech now, including dark money spending that were never considered to be speech before. But this really fundamental speech right, the right to protest peacefully, like these pipeline protesters have been doing, is now not just being kind of thwarted by the normal action of the, I would argue, overly robust police state, but is literally being funded by the very people who have an interest in suppressing the speech of the protesters in the first instance. Now, you alluded to your own battle with this kind of corporatized, privatized judicial system where after you won what I believe was the largest judgment ever against an oil company for their wanton pollution of the Amazon, you were literally placed under house arrest for over 1,000 days. For those who aren't aware of that, what lessons do you draw from the potential risks that come from an alliance between our criminal justice system and these corporate actors?
Well, thank you it's a great question. In my case, I helped indigenous peoples in Ecuador win roughly a $10 billion judgment against Chevron that's been affirmed by the Supreme Court of Ecuador and the Constitutional Court of Ecuador, and in part by the Supreme Court of Canada. And they attacked me here in the United States in New York, where I live, and had a judge charge me with contempt of court for appealing an order. I turned over my computer to Chevron, which is an unprecedented order, and I got locked up for 1,000 days. The prosecutor in my case wouldn't prosecute me. He rejected the case. So the judge appointed a private Chevron law firm to prosecute me in what I believe is the nation's first corporate private prosecution of anyone in the history of our country. And, take it back to Enbridge and what they did at Line 3. you were seeing an increasing alliance between elements of our government and the corporate elite to carry out the will of the corporate elite. I mean, I'm older than you guys. You know, I grew up in the 70s and 80s. I saw people like Ralph Nader really utilize government as a check on corporate power. What I've really seen the last 10, 15 years in a really accelerated fashion is government almost seems in some instances to become an instrument of corporate control rather than a check on corporate control. And I think you saw that at Line 3. And I'll point out there's still 200 people out in Minnesota who are facing sometimes very serious criminal charges for engaging in peaceful protest against the pipeline. I'm talking about felony trespassing.
Well,
you know, historically, to protest in this country a pipeline, you would never get charged with a felony. You would never spend a day in jail. It's part of our tradition of peaceful protest. So I think these trends are scary. And I think people, you know, part of the problem is they're not that noticeable often. And I think people need to pay attention to the fact that increasingly our public functions of government, be it policing or our judiciary, are being financed and controlled by corporations that have really private interests and stand most to benefit from the actions they are funding. And I just think it's wrong. And I don't think corporations police in this country.
Speaking though of the charges, the felony. So in this Star Tribune story, they highlight two felony charges of aiding attempted suicide, which I found baffling. But what I understand now is that the two people arrested had crawled into the actual pipeline and I guess they brought breathing equipment and had to be removed from there. So it's a very, I mean, sounds to me like they were in some danger, and that now they've been charged for that. It's kind of attempting suicide is kind of an odd charge, even in general. But I don't know. That's a serious kind of trespassing where you could put yourself at actual risk, in my view. So I don't know what you think should be done there. But it's not just standing on some property that's not yours.
Yeah, but I mean, is that a felony? I mean, people have a right to engage in civil disobedience. I'm not, they willingly take the risk knowing that they are trying to make a point. I think to be charged in that case you mentioned, each was charged with aiding the suicide of the other when they were friends and when crawled in the pipeline together to sort of delay or halt its construction. I mean, to me, come on. These people should not be put in jail. They should not be charged with felonies. But I think what I'm noticing with these overcharging in this situation and other situations is sort of an attempt, I think, to intimidate activists into not engaging in the protest that is necessary, I think, to save the planet. I mean, this is connected to the climate crisis, right? I mean, if pipelines and the fossil fuel companies keep building out and growing, while the planet is slowly being destroyed and people aren't allowed to protest that, I think we're going to be in serious, serious trouble. When you lock up lawyers like myself, and I don't really want to be the center of this story, it's about really something else. When you start locking up people for long periods of time like this who are engaging in this type of activity, I think you're really, really giving the industry way too much control over our public functions of government. And I think hurting the ability to save the planet at the same time.
Yeah,
I'll say that the woman.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say to Robbie, I think that he's kind of, that example really proves the point that, as a libertarian, I would expect that you probably don't believe in criminalization of suicide, period. That was a huge battle that was fought decades ago in this country about whether or not conservatives really meant what they said when certain states allowed physician-assisted suicide. And then kind of national Republicans decided to try to intervene between the states, which, states' rights usually, what they had said their citizens were allowed to do and what they decided to do on behalf of kind of a more evangelical religious right. In this instance, two people who obviously are not trying to commit suicide and obviously are not trying to endanger each other are being subject to a trumped up charge that could put them in jail in order to deter them from protesting something that otherwise would be permitted or at least subject to a much lower level of sanction, because again, these corporations are aligning with the state in order to ramp up the criminal penalties involved here. And we talk about the word fascism a lot. We throw the word fascism a lot these days, but this kind of literal alignment between the state and corporate forces is what the term was intended to actually describe. But I didn't mean to interrupt you there, Stephen.
I was going to say, another aspect of the broader issue is there is an attempt by the fossil fuel industry to criminalize protests. You're seeing this all over the place. And lawyering as well. You saw it with me. You're seeing it, with what I'm talking about at Line 3. There's a woman named Jessica Resnicek who engaged in an act of civil disobedience in a pipeline in Iowa and took a blowtorch to it and, caused damage to property, didn't harm anybody. And when she got sentenced, her normal sentence would be 3 years in prison. The U.S. government, under the Biden administration, by the way, asked for a terrorist enhancement. So the court gave it. She added another 5 years to a 3-year sentence. So she's now serving 8 years. It's just outrageous that you would consider someone who engaged in property destruction in an act of civil disobedience to save our planet a terrorist. But this is an extreme example of more broadly what's happening, which is the industry, and a lot of times judges are going along with this, is trying to criminalize what used to be considered normal, peaceful, respectable civil disobedience as a form of protest.
Well, it goes to show how the terrorist label, or more kind of national security concerns, putting people on watch lists, that kind of behavior, Republicans were all for it, and thinking this is only going to be used against Muslim people, and now they're all upset. They want to disband the entire national security, national investigation apparatus because of how some Trump protesters have been treated. So it's a good lesson in how these policies can be used against your own cause if you give big powerful people more opportunity and power to wield such power. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
More Rising right after this.